Do you remember last year? I mean, vaguely, dismally, and with a slightly worried expression, right? If you looked at a political website last year, you probably needed to have a strong drink of something with you, not the coffee they sell in Cape Town, something far stronger than that. And do you remember that moment in December last year? I know you will. I know you'll know where you were. I know what you were watching or what you were listening to. Some you might have had the radio and the TV on at the same time. And there was that moment. You know which moment, right? There was that moment when you went, it's a middle-class audience, I know we all agree. And there was that moment when you thought, actually, the worst is done. We've dodged the bullet, to quote Stilley. And then, come to March this year, we have a new president, we have a new catch sign, we have new things happening in Parliament, we have a new cabinet mostly. And actually, you probably feel more scared now than you did a year ago. And there are all sorts of reasons for this. And journalism, have you noticed, is exactly the same. Last year, South African journalism surely had our biggest triumph in the history of South African journalism. I'm talking, of course, about the Gupta email leaks. And yet, look around. We have no money. People still hate us. Everything seems to be going badly. We have news websites that are battling. One of the biggest newspaper groups, one of the oldest media organizations in this country, is probably about to run out of money come September or so. I won't name names because he's already been mentioned. In other words, what's happening to the country, I think, is happening to South African journalism. But journalism is a lot like South Africa. It's tough, it's resilient, and it's necessary. Please welcome my panel. I'd like to invite Kate Skinner, the Executive Director of the South African National Editors Forum. I'd like to invite Adriaan Basson, the editor of News24, Stefan Sprummer, journalist and managing partner at Amabungani Center for Investigative Journalism, and Monli Makanya, the editor of the City Press newspaper and president of the Badabile Dlamini fan club. You're only last because you have the funniest line. I'd like to start with the Gupta emails. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Stefan, surely the Gupta emails, or the Gupta leak emails, as Branko keeps telling me to call them, in the history of our journalism, the biggest expose with the most explosive material, with the biggest political impact?
I'd say certainly since '94. I mean, we had some big stories before then, and there have been many, many big stories since. So let's not blow the bugle too much. But yes, I think what we, Daily Maverick, News24, and a few others did here was something quite special.
Monli, we all know what the number 179 means in South Africa, right? 179 votes was the difference. Would it have gone the other way?
Yeah, you know what? I think I'm less half empty than you are. Yeah, I'm a lot more optimistic about where we're at. And I think it's because what happened in December was because of the constant hammering that the media and civil society did. I mean, let's go back to Nkandla, let's go back to other corruption stories, the Guptas, and the big one of last year. And I think the national mood definitely changed, the mood inside the ANC definitely changed. And okay, we do have to credit a certain man from Mpumalanga for switching sides as well, for those 179 votes. But I think that the role that the media played, and it's not just kind of like backslapping among ourselves, was very critical in us achieving that turnaround as a nation.
I don't think anyone on the panel will disagree, just because we won't be allowed to stay on the panel if we do. Adriaan, for years and years, we've had politicians telling us as journalists that we're wrong, that we're agendaed, that we hate the ANC, that we're anti-revolutionary, anti-majoritarian, which politician used to use that phrase. He used to support Jacob Zuma, he doesn't anymore. There are moments where you find out as a journalist what it's like, I know you've been through this, what it's like when Luthuli House issues a statement addressing you personally. Then you kind of know you've made it, right? Do you think that mud has stuck? Or do you think something else has happened? That over the years, on Nkandla, we were right and the politicians were wrong. On the Guptas, we were right and the politicians were wrong. Do you think actually, in some cases or in some sectors of society, journalists have more respect than politicians do?
Stephen, I think there's not one simple answer to that question. I think I'd like to believe that events like the one we're having here today proves that there's a serious number of people who value what we do as journalists, who are willing to put the money behind what they say and support, willing to pay a ticket to come here, who's going to support the Mavericks' new project, will subscribe to other services. So I do think if you look at the kind of market of people who are supporting journalism and valuing the role, it is there, and this is testament to that. At the same time, I do think journalism is in a crisis, and I think that's one of the issues. For a long time, we assumed our credibility. We assumed people must respect us and believe us just because we are journalists. I think that time is gone. I think we have to earn our respect again. We have to explain to people what our profession is about, how we get our stories. I saw now the Amabungane new website this morning actually take people virtually into their newsroom. I think that's great because it gives people ownership of the process of journalism. So I think we need to do more. I think we cannot just assume anymore that you come to work, do your story, and go home. Just a last remark, maybe. I track the trust in journalism quite closely, and the Edelman research that comes out annually recently showed that trust in journalism has increased by 7 percentage points globally over the past year, where trust in the platforms, mainly in Facebook and Google, has decreased by 5 percentage points. So I think we're also reaching a point now in time where the population and readers are realizing that Facebook isn't journalism, that Google isn't journalism, they don't employ newsrooms. That's us. And I think that, maybe thanks to Donald Trump, that some of that trust is returning to credible news outlets.
I mean, trust is so important. Dr. Kate Skinner. This is one of those things where you've got to build trust. How do you go about doing that in a world in which people are told literally not to trust the media anymore?
And you're right. I mean, there is definitely, in terms of, Adrian, it's interesting what you're talking about in terms of certain research, which is saying that media is more trustworthy. I mean, there's other research that basically says that, people's interest in news per se is actually getting less and less. And they're sort of saying, actually, we'd prefer to, watch celebrity, whatever kind of stuff instead. But I think that in terms of credibility issues, quality journalism is something that I think you just cannot get away from. And I think that, for instance, with the Gupta leaks, once you had that kind of level of cooperation, the quality of that journalism, its power, people then flock to it and see its value. And so I think that that's what we need to be concentrating on as the media more and more, is, this is the place that you come to when you want to actually find out what's going on, when you want that analysis, when you want that context, you come to particular established kind of media organization, but not only established, but other ones that have built credibility, and I think that's critical.
In other words, it's about a lot more than just the facts. The facts are on Twitter.
Exactly.
No.
Well, although the facts can be, yeah.
I do want to talk about, and Kate, I do want to stay with you. I mean, with all of this trust and the fact that perhaps we, as journalists are trusted more than some politicians, it doesn't help us financially at all. I mean, if you look around newsrooms at the moment, juniorization, media gathering after media gathering, we talk about it. People seem to be losing jobs, audiences. You may have a big audience, but no revenue coming in. I mean, it seems to be getting tougher and tougher to do the kind of journalism, the kind of quality journalism that this country needs.
Completely. And I think this is where people are looking at multiple streams of income. So the issues around paywalls, which actually can be quite scary, because that means that there's certain people that can't necessarily access all that journalism. For instance, these events. That's another way of bringing in revenue. And of course all the donors that are coming in. So it's you've got to be a lot more creative and find more kind of streams of funding. But I think ultimately we've got to talk about the fact that we have to have more money coming into journalism, and then we have to maybe look at something quite radical, which is Facebook, Google. How do they contribute back into journalism? And I think that we really have to look at that, because there's just no way around it. They cannot be making that amount of money and benefiting from us.
Yeah. Stefans, the Amabungane model, the Scorpio model as well, I mean, how's it working out? 28% of your money is coming from donations, the rest from reader donations, the rest is coming from elsewhere. How sustainable is the model?
Right, I think, look, we're a non-profit, and that is still a somewhat unusual model, especially in South Africa. So we have a budget of between 8 and 10 million rands a year. It's a lot of money, but good quality journalism, and especially investigative journalism, costs good money. Right, so the largest portion of our funding comes from your big foundational funders, your open societies, Millennium Trust, Media Network is a new one. But what we want to do is to grow the percentage that the public pays towards what we do. It's the user pays principle. But because we're a non-profit, because we want to serve everyone, we don't want that to be simply, we want it to come from people who do it voluntarily and, if necessary, on quite a small scale. We've grown that. The 28% last year, that was 2.3 million rands, was quite exceptional, I think. We're still aiming much higher, but I think the 2.3 was also pretty much tied to the Gupta Leaks success. So one shouldn't expect that it's going to be easy to replicate. But I think it's an educational process. South Africans need to understand, as they've come to understand in some other countries, that journalism is worth supporting. It's a public good. Donors, your big donors, fortunately do understand that to a large extent, but not to the extent that it's going to carry the entire independent media, for example.
Are you vulnerable to a few big donors? I mean, if there's a big shift, I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa becomes the ANC leader after Nasrec, suddenly people who maybe gave you money for not the most best intentions suddenly pull out? I mean, do you become a bit vulnerable at times?
One is vulnerable, but that's why, A, we want to increase the public proportion, the crowdfunding part of our funding, get that over 50%, it makes us much less vulnerable. But B, we also try to balance our income from foundations. So we've had cases where foundations asked whether they could give us more than we would accept. We do not want any of them to be donating over 20%, and preferably less. So we've been balancing it out. We've been recruiting new donors over time so as to make us less vulnerable. But yes, the Ramaphosa election, the New Dawn, certainly made one substantial foundational funder just kind of disappear. We had been told there's a million rands which we could apply for, and we applied in the ordinary course of events, but they went quiet. And it would seem to us that what happened in turn is that whoever has been funding them, quite a few of them turned around and said, what's the problem? Why do we need to give money now?
I'd like to talk a bit about censorship. And over the years, I mean, I find, sort of watching politics and journalism, that as a politician rises in power and consolidates, so their levers of persuasion over the media increase. And then when you have a situation when all of the politicians are weak, the media can be at its strongest. Mondi Makanya, you're someone who's had to face down tough politicians in your time at the Sunday Times and at the City Press. We've seen sort of probably two waves of that kind of censorship in post-democratic South Africa. Mbeki to an extent during those times. If you published something he didn't like, you knew about it. And then again towards the end of the Zuma time, there'll be threats of censorship, and it never happened. I would like to suggest that the politics of the country now, plus a few changes in technology, means that threat of censorship might actually have receded a little bit.
Not of the mainstream media. I think, and you take it back to Mbeki, I think there was a point early in the Mandela years when he was also a bit intolerant of the media, because not because he was against media freedom, but it was more a question of give us time, give us space, we've just come in, and he actually had to have a talking to by senior journalists to say, no, look, this is a free country. And it converted him, and he became the greatest champion.
Who was in that room?
Some people that you do know. Yeah. But I think that we should expect at all times that governments, politicians, no matter where you are, in the most democratic of states, in what is mostly, what you say, the most civilized, advanced of democracies will have an instinct towards trying to curb media freedom and freedom of expression because it threatens their power. So it's something that we always have to exist with. So yes, censorship does become more difficult, but it will not stop them from trying to censor us. Especially in a country where you still have very much a one-party dominant system. And in the Mbeki years, for instance, we had a government that they tried to use the government's coffers and the advertising budget to censor the media. Mbeki was a lot more sophisticated than the guys who came after him, obviously, who then came with a huge sledgehammer and tried to introduce the secrecy bill, tried to introduce the media tribunal and so on, and they were much more vocal about their hatred for the media and the need. In fact, Blake Nzimande even suggested at some point that we need insult laws so that people cannot insult the president. But yes, so that technology has made it a lot more difficult. And because what you cannot do here and you can do offshore anyway, so there's nothing that a government in a certain jurisdiction can do today to stop media freedom, but it will not stop them from actually trying.
It helped in a way that Hlaudi Motsoeneng tried so hard.
Stephen, if I can just quickly maybe add to that question, I think it's a very interesting topic. Technology had its benefits, but there's also been a new layer of sophisticated intimidation and censorship introduced through the advent of social media, for example. I mean, I don't have to tell you that, especially as a white journalist, if you write something critical of a specific political party or politician, you are trolled on social media. That's my personal experience. If there's, and I've seen it in our newsrooms, young journalists get almost scared or intimidated by that very vile reaction on a platform like Twitter, where if you publish a story, I mean, we've seen this for many years, especially on corruption. People try to attack you through other avenues, through racism or any other type of criticism. And I think social media has almost led, and you can now pay bots in countries like India or Israel, where people unleash thousands of bots onto you and your platform if you distribute this content. So there's almost a new style of censorship that has a chilling effect on specifically young journalists who don't want to put themselves out for this kind of vile attack, often by faceless bots who are not really a person. And then secondly, an example we recently experienced at News 24 was there was a very vicious cyber attack on our sites from one specific story. And I can't unfortunately name the story yet because we are still in process of investigating whether indeed it was this person. But there was these thousands of bots again hitting our site until one of our properties fell over, literally, to close down the entire site, ultimately forcing us to take that story off the site because that's the only way we could pick up our site again. So we had to very drastically do stuff in terms of the background and strengthen our own firewalls. So technology has also opened up new avenues for attack, for censorship and for intimidation.
Kate, I mean, one of the things, I mean, if you go back to the 1970s, the only journalists who had to worry about their image were probably news anchors in the United States. With Twitter, I worry sometimes that journalists spend far too much time, including myself, I mean, doing what I do, far too much time thinking about how I will look doing a story rather than whether the story needs to be done.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because I was at a panel at UJ yesterday, and we were talking to a whole lot of students, and one of the big things that the students actually raised was this whole thing actually about celebrities. They're saying, you know, what's happening now more and more is that journalists are celebrities, and that is like so irritating. Like, can they just not tell us the story? And I thought that was very interesting that it was coming from a student, because I was like, but that's how, you know, culture is moving, you know, celebrities are like, so I said, you know, it's a kind of double-edged sword, because in some ways it's quite good. If you have a number of journalists that are seen as celebrities, you might have a lot more people following them, but then you also don't want to like undermine the actual content of stories. So I think it's a difficult one, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have journalists playing this role of being kind of thought leaders, particularly if they are raising a whole lot of very important issues, which are not just fluff, but actually news issues.
haven't heard many people suggesting that celebrity journalists is a good thing. Does everyone agree? Well, we've got the editor of Sunday Times and City Press, Adrian.
Look, I mean, just
Yeah.
speaking from personal experience,
Yeah.
I agree with Kate that it's a two-edged sword. And again, I don't know if young journalists specifically can handle that attention in the early years, but it's benefited me personally greatly on being on Twitter, for example. People actually get you there. They send you tip-offs on direct message. They send you documents. So I've seen that benefit of doing that. But I also think there's a risk of young people going into journalism because they want to be celebrities, which is completely the wrong reason.
I just stay away.
I'm still trying to convince Mondi to jump onto Twitter.
I'll SMS you, I'll WhatsApp you.
But I think, if I could just add to that, I think we spoke earlier about trust and credibility, and I think that if to an extent you open up your investigation, your research process, Twitter is a very useful process for that, very useful tool. But yes, again, the double-edged sword. People start whacking you, and maybe inadvertently you give away something that alerts someone and your story gets closed, blocked off somewhere else again, etc.
Okay, I want to change the subject a little bit. And it's fascinating. A few years ago, if we had to talk about, if we went 10 years ago, threats to journalism in South Africa were probably government censorship. That's what we would focus on. About 5 years ago, we started to focus on the lack of money. And that's become an increasing problem. In my analysis, I think the biggest problem facing journalism might be something very different, and it's about, I think, a fundamental shift about what's happening in society. And that's what I would call the splintering of audiences. So in the United States, you know the classic example. If you voted for Hillary Clinton, you watched CNN. If you voted for Donald Trump, you watched Fox. And if you want Fox, I'll have a conversation with you outside. But the point is that the media has become a place that is not where the national conversation happens anymore. It's not what they used to call the marketplace of ideas. And instead, no one talks to each other. They talk only to themselves or people like them. And I wonder that this is beginning to happen in our country as well. That, people use the phrase tribes in the sense of sort of communities, that things become tribal. You either back Trump or you back Clinton, and therefore you watch one or the other. Mondi, I want to start with you on this. Do you see that happening in this country?
Yeah, definitely. But before I go there, I must just say, I love Fox. I think Fox and NN7, two most entertaining TV channels on earth.
Afro worldview.
Yeah, I say it's Afro worldview, whatever it is.
Exactly.
Do we care?
Yeah, and I think it's a massive problem. I mean, like if you look, for instance, the US is a classic example. I mean, like Trump supporters only want to hear what they want to hear, and they only want to believe what they want to believe. Forget about the facts. Yeah. We saw it with Brexit. The Brexit, the Leave supporters. The facts didn't matter, kind of like the impact on their lives that leaving the EU would have. They didn't care about that. All they wanted to believe was that Romanian immigrants are eating their hamsters or whatever it is, and that was what they wanted to believe. And we've seen it in this country. I mean, over the past few years, I mean, like the hardcore Zuma supporters only want to hear what they wanted to hear, and they did not want to hear other truths. I mean, even to this day, I mean, like whenever Zuma appears in court, there's a song they love to sing called Wenzenu Zuma, basically, which means what has Zuma done? I mean, if anybody's still asking that question in 2018. And then, similarly, I mean, like there's a segment of the population in South Africa that genuinely believes that there is a genocide against Afrikaners and particularly farmers. I mean, like that there is a deliberate genocide, and you can't argue with them. And then there's another segment of people who have been led to believe that give the land back and we will all be healthy and wealthy and all our problems will go away. And you cannot have a rational conversation about land. So that splintering is very real, and it's people who basically it makes it difficult for us. And I think okay, let me make a confession here, because I have also of my own weaknesses, and because I don't read stories about some of the stuff that Catholic priests have gotten up to in the past, because I don't want it to be true. So I, yeah. But I think, the way, we can try all we can and try to compromise with audiences about trying to avoid that splintering. I think the most important thing for us to do is to do what we do. We do journalism. At the beginning of Nkandla, I'll go back to Nkandla, there were people who didn't see what was wrong with Nkandla, but because the media kept hammering on this thing, the story got bigger, people turned around. A lot of people didn't see what was wrong with Zuma, and the tide turned against Jacob Zuma. The Guptas eventually became the devils in the eyes of every South African because we kept on doing that. And I think that so long as we do what we do and not try to compromise with sectional interests here and there, eventually the truth does prevail.
I want to come to Stephan. I'm sorry, Adrian. And I mean, the reason I say that is that, you might think that your model makes you almost immune to that. But what you would have, there's a situation where the biggest possible story that you do that has huge political implications, you get it in the biggest outlets in the country. And, in the United States during Watergate, I think Democrat and Republican voters all read the Washington Post. And that changed the dial as a result. It changed people's minds. In this country, now in the United States, Donald Trump's people can't say he didn't use the N-word. And if he did say that he did, it wouldn't change what people think of him. That means that the stories you do have no impact, which means that journalism doesn't matter.
Yeah. Look, it is that loss of the marketplace, and it is simply because you have a fragmentation of the means by which people can communicate. So it was a great democratization in a way. We all said, at last, ordinary people can publish to others. And that's social media, but it's also setting up news sites, etc., etc. Lowered the entry cost very, very significantly. So it's a technological revolution that meant that whereas previously, because of the high entry costs, in a city you would have one or two newspapers, in a country you would have, only a handful of major papers. Everyone would communicate across that same platform. Now there are all these platforms, and that is the root cause of this thing. In our particular case, I think where we can sort of help bridge this divide between different platforms, the fragmentation that results, is our model is one of distributed publication. Amabungane's is. Now, obviously, not everyone else can do that. We publish on our own website for the record and as a resource for interacting with readers. But for the rest, we try to follow audiences to where they are. So, for argument's sake, we could have published via Jimmy Manyi if we had bothered to build up enough of a relationship with him. And maybe that would become necessary in future. So I think one should, there's self-selection of audiences. People ignore what they don't want to hear. I think it may be incumbent on us as journalists to say, well, let us not self-select how we get heard. Let's not preach to those who want to listen to what we say. Let's try and reach the rest.
I think this is very interesting to me. I think there's two big parts to it. The one is the complete decimation of the mainstream media model, and that happened in the West, in the States, and it's happening here at the moment. So the mainstream media model of 10 years ago is no longer. It isn't anymore. There's not even a body where all the print media owners sit together anymore. Even that has collapsed. So I think that has had its advantages and disadvantages. Advantages in the way Stephan so eloquently explained. It democratized media. Any man or woman with a laptop could now run a publication from the grubby flat in Woodstock. But I think what we have also seen in this fragmentation, nothing against Woodstock, love it. What we have also seen with the fragmentation is the introduction of fake news. Because you now had trade unions, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, developing and putting up their own media houses and publications, like, for example, Marula Media in this country, where a trade union with a very specific political slant now pretends to also be a publisher of media and have journalists in their employ publishing a certain stories that drives a very certain narrow agenda, and I think that's what you're referring to. So all of this links, in my mind, back to the economy, the change of the economy of the media model, that you no longer need millions of rands to put up a printing press in Pardon Island, but that you can literally publish from laptops. But I've also seen in this process, because fake news has been so prevalent and has almost taken over the space and the discussion on social media, I've also seen recently a return to good journalism and to the truth. For a long time, it was almost cool, to talk about post-truth and the end of history and, truth. There's no truth, actually. I think that tide is changing. I honestly think so. If we see it in our own numbers, we see the type of page views we get on stories like the Gupta leaks. People often joke, and even before I became the editor of News 24, I wondered, oh goodness, is it true that only the Kardashians and cat pictures get the big numbers? Turns out not to be true. Very often, those stories that we publish from Amabungane or our own investigative journalism pieces, and almost every Sunday, Mondi's lead story is the top read story on that day across our entire platform on News 24. Millions of people want to read good news. Millions of people want to read the truth, still believe in that. And I think we're in a good space. I think that tide has turned from a few years ago, where it was really just free for all and everyone with a laptop could publish.
Kate, I'd like to hear you on this.
So, the thing that I think is quite important is in fact the public broadcaster. So I'm kind of looking at you while I'm saying that, and there's still an incredibly important role for that public broadcaster. And although I hear kind of people making quite disparaging comments, oh the SABC, oh hopeless, losing money again, but the fact is that it still has enormous audiences. If you look at the SABC One, if you look at Ukhozi, enormous audiences. And interestingly, I think it's the one place where you do get different classes, races, gender, coming together and having a conversation. I'm thinking about SAFM, for instance, in terms of some of the interesting kind of conversations across class, race, gender. And I think that that's why a public broadcaster is so important. And often in times of crisis, that's when people go to that one particular place. Obviously, it's got to be credible. It's got to be an institution, that is well run and all of those kind of things. But I just think we cannot move away from the fact that any media landscape needs a public broadcaster where citizens across the board can come and talk.
Dirk de Vos, I know you're here.
Yes, Dirk
I
de
saw
Vos,
the piece
I
you wrote.
disagree with you.
My response will be published on Friday. And not just because of where I work. Okay, how do we insulate ourselves from this problem? We've spoken about basically truth. I would like to, there was this idea, and for years, politicians would start a press conference by asking journalists if they were objective. And they'd always be shocked when I'd say, no, I'm not objective, and I've never said I would be. I would like to introduce the concept of fairness instead, because I think fairness is more human. Do you, Mondli, do we keep a large audience and basically keep the mainstream media in a way through newspapers, websites, and broadcasts, etc., by being fair? In other words, if you're going to do a critical story of someone, unlike a small fake news website or a small union website with a particular slant, you make sure the other side, the other point of view is expressed properly.
Yeah, there is a cliche in our industry that credibility is our currency. So without that, we're nothing. So you have to be fair. Fairness has to be ultimate. You have to be accurate, and also people must be able to trust you in the sense of why are you doing the story? Is there a hidden agenda behind it? So your bona fides then matter there. Yeah. And I think that, which is why having institutions that we have in our industry, such as the BCCSA and the Press Council, for instance, have met, and it was important that they become very public institutions, that people know about them, that they know that they have a guardian, that those institutions are not on our side as media, they're actually on the side of the public good. Yeah. I think what has happened, unfortunately, on the negative side, and it was a major blow, was the fact that when independent newspapers pulled out of the press council system. Now, independent newspapers runs newspapers, I mean, like they have a virtual monopoly on the daily market here, KZN, Gauteng. And if you have that group not in the system, and where the person out there, the public, thinks that it does not have a champion, a guardian that they can go to, it undermines the entire ecology. And I think it's a huge problem that we face. But I think that, but what is important is that most of the media, broadcast and broadcast digital and print, are still within, are still guided by proper journalistic principles.
In a way, and I'm going to ask Kate this because you're not a working journalist, if I can put it like that, slightly above the rest of us. But there are certain hard cases. I think it is hard as a journalist to report on Donald Trump. I think it got hard, and I speak just for myself, but I think it got hard to be fair on Zuma or on someone like Hlaudi Motsoeneng. I think it got hard. I mean, I remember swearing at him in a Daily Maverick piece because I was actually, as a human, so angry that I needed to swear at him in a premeditated way. It wasn't an outburst. I actually wrote it down, and it was published because it was an important thing to say. Do you think, and I'll introduce the phrase by and large to give you a caveat, but do you think by and large South African journalism passed the fairness test on Jacob Zuma?
That's such an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, look, the thing which I do think is important is, and this is where I think it's interesting, because often people say that you want to have balance. So you want to have this, he said, she said, and you balance it out. But actually you don't. You want to have a multiple set of views. And I'm not sure, but the thing is that there are a lot of people that have supported Zuma and still support Zuma now. And possibly, if I'm playing devil's advocate, possibly we should have actually gone to find out more about why people did still support him. And that would have given more context and more nuance and more understanding of where we're at in terms of our politics. Because if you just write somebody off, in the same way with Hlaudi Motsoeneng, you just write him off and you say, yeah, absolutely hopeless, really useless. You don't get into some of the very interesting issues of why they are powerful and why they hold on to power.
I mean, there's analysis there, but there's also, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person here who's gone to people who support Zuma outside court and asked, why are you here? I often battle to understand, and I think this was perhaps a failing on my part journalistically, to understand their answers.
Yeah, and you know, I think that's a major failing as well of the mainstream American media, and is that they tended to look down on Trump supporters. I mean, like there were this strange phenomenon and rednecks and so on, hillbillies. And I think in this country we may have played into his hands because he was portraying himself as a man of the people. He had all these people around, I mean, basically kind of like the broad masses supporting them, and he was going to do this thing, and he had this narrative that I'm being opposed because I want to do great things for you. And he humbled himself to their level, which perhaps we didn't do. And it might be a major, I'm not admitting to it, I'm just saying that it may have been a major failing of ours to actually go to those people and actually understand kind of like the psyche of a Zuma supporter. Because that Zuma supporter still remains a Zuma supporter in many parts of the country, even today. I mean, like, which is why you still get thousands of people outside court attending his thing. That's why you can still have arguments about Jacob Zuma with some people. But you know what? I would not have sleepless nights about that. I think what matters to me is, did the South African media do South Africa justice by consistently investigating Jacob Zuma right from the beginning, from 2002, when he was still deputy president, right up until now? And I think we did that.
Kate?
Yeah.
For a horrible moment, I thought no one was going to clap. Kate, I mean, to listen to Mondi, I mean, the phrase I kept hearing in my head was othering. You know, that if you supported Zuma, you were other. I remember doing interviews, I think I'm allowed to still say the name, on the Midday Report on 702. And I knew if I was talking to someone, the way to sink them was to say, but didn't you support the Guptas when? That was all I needed to say. Then everybody knew. Now, those code words are useful journalistically, and I think all journalists use them. This person supported, I don't know, Kebby Maphatswe or someone, right? And yet, in the process, you're denying that person their own sort of sense of self and a slight thing. I mean, is that something we need to worry about, that othering of someone? You supported Zuma, therefore.
Yeah, you know, it's a very interesting issue, and I think that possibly you're right, that in fact it is important to actually hear what the person has got to say right now, and to kind of write them off so that people are like, oh, well, obviously, whatever this person's going to say, I'm going to just block my mind. I'm not going to think about it because clearly they're just not credible, and what they're going to say is not going to be something I need to listen to. So yes, Stephen, I think that we should be careful of that.
All right. We will take some questions towards the end in about 5 to 10 minutes. If you've got something that you want to think about, if you've got a question you'd like to ask, you just need to put up your hand, and I think there'll be a microphone around somewhere.
If I can quickly just maybe chip in, Stephen, at this point when you're asking for questions, to say, just in response to us being fair to politicians and people supporting, I read a very interesting article, and I'm going to try and experiment with that in my own newsroom now, which is kind of called the truth sandwich. So it's a model that the Washington Post came up with to say that for a very long time, journalists have been giving, and I again think this probably started or became popular under Donald Trump, but we very much have some examples of that in our own society, in our own politics, where journalists just report what a politician says from a podium, okay? And I know those very sensational statements get the clicks and will get the page views. But the argument goes that we have a bigger responsibility than reporting. We actually have a responsibility towards the truth as well. So when a politician says A, B, C, you should actually, as a reporter on that story, just add the facts about what that politician has said. So if the politician quotes numbers, I remember Farrell's book, for example, debunked all the figures being bandied about black ownership on the JSE, for example. If a politician says something, just actually as a journalist sit down on your ass for 2 minutes and get the right fact and add that into your story. And I know it's a hard thing, it's a culture change, it's a behavior change, because social media has made us so fast. Who's going to be first with the story? Are we going to miss the new Malema headline? But actually, I think in the long term, it will serve us all very well, maybe not to be first, but sit back and just add that truth. Do your own research as well, not only quote what people say. So, look, we are having these conversations. It's tough. The digital model has made things almost overwhelmingly fast, but I think we are evolving, and I think the discussion is coming up with some interesting solutions.
Mondi.
Just very quickly, just some to add to a question you asked of Stefan earlier on. Just about whether, when we hammer, when we expose, and nothing happens immediately. And I mean, it can be quite demoralizing and dispiriting, because you really think that, you've brought this thing to the public mind. Something has to happen, something will happen. But there are certain winds, certain tides in history that you cannot stand in the way of. I mean, Trump was a tide that, I think, despite the best reporting from the best, kind of like finest outlets in the world, that could not be stopped. The rise of the right wing in Europe right now, it's a time that's there. And I think with us in this country, I think the swing away from the distant Mbeki, the formalistic Mbeki time, and towards a populist Zuma who was charismatic and more appealing and more sort of man of the people, as he said. I don't think anything could have stood in the way of that at that particular time, especially considering the forces that he had on his side, like the trade union movement, the Communist Party, the Youth League, and so on. And I think, but ultimately, as I said earlier on, 2017 does happen. 2017 happened. I mean, like, massive swing in public opinion, and happened, and December happened, and we are where we are today. So I thought, yeah, just I said briefly, but yeah. But the thing is, the fact that we didn't stop and said this is irrelevant, nothing is happening as a result of that, and I think it achieved something in the end.
It also shows you how important cumulative work is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just while we're on social media, you know, it's such an interesting point, because I think that has changed journalism hugely, but not for Amabungani. What's that like when you don't have to worry so much about being first on Twitter? I mean, what I'm really going to is it shows you the value that you add that other people who are addicted to being first don't add.
Yeah, look, I think maybe I don't even know what it's like on the other side because I haven't been there. When I was last there, it was before there was a thing called Twitter. But for now, you know, we do use social media quite heavily, but it is more for this kind of, well, a bit of propagating stories and so on, but it is for interacting. And I think very importantly for transparency, and that's the layer of cheese that I want to add to Adrian's sandwich, is it's not just fairness, it's not just facts. It's also to say, where do we come from? If we want to build credibility amongst audiences, we've got to be transparent about our own subjective where we come from, and secondly, about our facts. You know, the fake news sites can mimic all of the kind of the trappings of professional journalism, but they cannot fake facts quite that easily. So once we start appending documents to our stories, and if I may just kind of do a little plug for our new website, which we launched today. It has this entire open newsroom section, and people can come there and they can interact and they can learn about what we're doing with stories. We've got this docket. People can go into the docket and they can, with some stories, access reams and reams of evidence. So you don't believe what we say, well, look at the evidence yourself.
Okay. Stephen, just like one other issue, just on the credibility and building the credibility, it's also for people to understand, like, who funds you. And I mean, I was just thinking about Amabi. And it's amazing, on your site, it's like all your funders. It's so transparent and so clear, like who owns you, who funds you, who are the people that are actually doing the investigations. And I think those kinds of things actually matter.
I do want to ask you a question before we take questions. This is my last question before we take questions. I remember sitting here last year and I suggested at one point that we might have a time when governments feel as a social need they actually fund units like Amabungani, because investigative journalism matters, and for the society to have credibility, for a government to have credibility in some strange ways. And I think legitimacy is becoming a real issue for everybody, legitimacy. I mean, it's very complex, and we can all understand it in different ways. But I think that day is actually going to come a lot closer than we think. Would you take money from government?
We would not, as things are now. We, in fact, explicitly do not take money from any governmental organization. So if USAID or one of these German Stiftungen come to us, we say no, thank you. We also don't take money from companies. So it's simply from large, credible charitable foundations and from members of the public.
Do the rest of you still think I'm smoking my socks when I say government will one day fund an Amabungani?
Government has funded the media for a long time.
And investigative journalists through state.
Government has funded the SABC completely for many years, which
no,
is a good
thing.
Completely. Almost completely.
And GCIS is one of the biggest channels of funding to the media. But I think
yeah. But it's a commercial.
So, yeah. In Sweden, for example, you do have a system where media is state-funded, and it's an interesting formula. So you're smaller, so you've got the kind of the incumbent main paper in a town. There's a formula by which government will then fund the smaller players so as to increase the competition. So it's a bit the opposite of how our parliamentary party funding system works. You don't fund the big guy the most, you fund the little guy more. But I think ideologically I have no problem as long as the mechanism is one that guarantees independence, and that's the catch.
And my sense is that you do need public funding. And in fact, if you look at the countries that have like some of the best media freedom, like statistics in the world, they are Sweden, Norway, Finland, Iceland. But it's exactly what you're saying, but you've got to safeguard the independence of those institutions, and so it's the way you fund. But the actual funding, absolutely.
All right.
On that. Very quick, I promise you. No, I think obviously we've got a commercial relationship with government. Government advertises a lot. They used to. It's a lot less now. But I do think that it would be immoral, I think, given the socio-economic circumstances of South Africa, for us as big media organizations to ever accept government funding when there are so many other needs. But I think for the small guys, your community media, the radio stations and little newspapers there, I think there is actually a responsibility for the government to make sure that those are sustainable. It's not a gift. I think those people have a right to have the small media.
Interesting point. All right, any questions? We've got one over there in the aisle. I can't see your face, I'm afraid, but your hand is up. Yes, you. I think a microphone is on its way. Otherwise, shout really loudly. AM radio moves faster than this microphone. Okay, there we are.
Thank you so much. My name is Sinawa Tambo. I'm a student at the University of Cape Town. So my question is basically on whether, in terms of the journalistic circles, right, whether there's any reflective work done on the historical biases that I've noticed with regards to the ANC particularly, right? Because what I've seen happen is that the media sort of rallies behind every new ANC president for a particular period of time, up until that term ends, and then they sort of rubbish that president and rally behind the new one. So we saw it at the end of Thabo Mbeki's term with the reflection on how he was so bureaucratic and distant, too formal, too out of touch with the people, which led to the rallying behind Zuma for a moment. And of course, rallying behind someone who's a man of the people, ended up building patronage networks and things like that, ended up in a process of corruption. So by the end of Zuma's term, we've of course seen almost nauseatingly liberal media mobilizing behind Ramaphosa. So every new ANC presidential term sort of sees the media, I don't know if it's a tacit acceptance of the ANC being the ruling party and of course wanting the best out of the ANC at some point, or whether of course the reality of many journalists having a background of being in the UDF or the Congress movement. But is there any reflection on those persistent biases that come out with relation to the ANC as well, and any reflective work on that within journalistic circles? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Look, we do reflect all the time. We reflect in our newsrooms, we reflect collegially on all things that are happening, not just a particular party or a thing that's happening at a particular time, but there's always reflection in our craft. On your thesis about inherent anti-ANC bias, the media, it's a trite point. The media has a role to play in a society, and that role includes holding power to account. Very important thing to do. And power, most power resides in government, and that's public power now. I know that corporates have wielded a lot of power, but that's power. Those people are elected, and we are there to hold them to account. And for the past 24 years, this country has been run by an ANC government. And necessarily, we will hold that ANC government to account, not because we don't like the ANC. We are holding that particular, government to account. Thabo Mbeki, if you look at his greater scorecard, he was a good president. With a 5% growth rate, he was economically, he was sound and all that. We did not wait until the end to question Thabo Mbeki, actually. The questioning of Thabo Mbeki began in 2000 when he started spouting all that gobbledygook about AIDS and his AIDS denialism, the media was key in taking him on and faced a lot of pressure from people in power and government and the ANC about that. But ultimately, the ANC even turned around and forced Mbeki to change his AIDS views. And you know that we eventually, the country adopted one of the most advanced AIDS rollouts in the whole world. So the media played its role there. We were not against Thabo Mbeki. Mbeki made other mistakes around Zimbabwe, around his protection of Jackie Silibi. We were not going to sit around and wait for and wait around while he does that. It was not because he was an ANC president. It was because he was the president of the Republic, and we were holding him to account as that. Insofar as the other guy is concerned, there was never an embrace of that guy. Right from the beginning. I mean, Zapiro was speaking earlier on about how the shower never went away. Right from the onset, we knew the man was corrupt, and we said the man was corrupt right from the beginning. And yes, he got a second term despite him being corrupt. And we've been writing those stories and broadcasting those stories right since before he came to power, but as president of the country from 2009 until he left. And it's not like we turned against him at the end. We gave him hell throughout his presidency, rightly so.
And he gave us hell back. Yes, yes, you, sir, in the second row there. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the question is, if you didn't hear at the back, the question is, every day this particular person, I'm sorry, sir, I don't know your name, you say you're bombarded by a certain type of propaganda from a certain regional newspaper. You're talking about independent newspapers. And the complaint is the money is money from the Public Investment Corporation. And where's the investigative journalism in pushing back? I've quoted you correctly? Right. And some people agree with you.
The investigative is right there. I mean, Amabungane, specifically Sam Sol, has been exposing the latest deals that the PIC did. Sorry, the question is around the PIC's funding of independent media and when are we going to start doing. So we've been writing a lot of those stories. Go and find them on our websites, News24 Amabungane. We've all been publishing those stories. And currently, my understanding is that the PIC is actually pulling out of independent media. They've announced that in a parliamentary answer recently in Parliament, that they are taking out their money out of that company. And I think that's why you probably earlier referred to the cash crisis that company may face later this year. But it will be bad for journalism, because the less newspapers, the less journalists are, the worse it is for our country and for democracy. We shouldn't celebrate the closing down of any title. It's about the funding and about the management of one man, but it's not about the people working at those titles.
Okay, we've got a minute and a half left. There's someone urgent question. Yes.
Hi, good afternoon.
Sorry, yes.
Can you hear me all, Stephen?
Thank you very much. There you are. Yes, hello.
Hello there. I'd like to, sorry, there's an awful echo. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go for it.
Yeah. I'd like to just address my question to Kate. Kate, I was born into the apartheid years and a listener of SABC when it was controlled by the National Party. The propaganda was immense. They banned the Beatles, unbelievably. And when you went through the Defence Force, the propaganda that SABC spewed out to generally the whites, but also everybody within the country, was quite enormous. I don't think SABC, and I'm mentioning it because you raised it a little bit earlier about the SABC and the important job they have as a national radio. My question is this: do you believe SABC is giving us a fair bash? In other words, we've got all this wonderful media, everybody's got WhatsApps, and we've got wonderful opportunity on the internet, but most of our country, probably 70%, do not have access to the internet. So they rely on radio. And I don't believe that SABC is giving us a good run for our money in terms of getting the message across from other political parties. They're using the same format that the old National Party used to use, where you would have, say, a politician. In those days, the National Party would say his piece, and then they'd have a so-called expert or qualified professor, but they wouldn't actually have the opposition party putting their point across. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen.
I don't know what to say, so I'll leave it to Kate.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's interesting to look at the way that the SABC post-apartheid has actually covered issues. If you look at elections, and Media Monitoring Africa has done a lot of independent monitoring of this. In fact, elections are covered very well by the ANC. I mean, by the ANC, let me hear, by the SABC. That was a Freudian slip. But the issue is about equitable coverage. So obviously they would cover the ANC more because it is the ruling party and it is the majority. But the problem is that they don't necessarily cover things in depth. You don't necessarily get like a very sort of in-depth sense of like what's going on. But certainly around elections, not actually at the end of that cloudy Motsoeneng time. That was a problem, and then certainly there was actual bias coming in. You could see it quite specifically, and for instance, the EFF wasn't covered sufficiently as one of the things that was happening. So I think that you cannot say that the SABC was the same under apartheid as it was post-apartheid. Of course, there have been biases. And the ANC has been covered probably given an unnecessarily easy ride. But it is interesting to note the way that elections have been covered. And most elections have been covered in a way that has been equitable and fairly fair. And I think that you have to acknowledge that. And again, that is why I think that it is so important that you do have a public broadcaster. You're constantly vigilant. You constantly fight for it to play that important role in terms of covering everybody equitably. But to say that it just doesn't, and it's the same as under apartheid, is just not correct.
30 seconds.
Okay, I've told Mondli 30 seconds.
30 seconds. I just want to again counter something you said at the beginning about about a slightly pessimistic view you were taking about where we're at. I actually think we are in a very good space, not excellent space. I think we're in a good space as a country. You know, this time last year, the bad guys were in charge. This time, the bad guys are fighting back against an attempt to actually rein them in and hold them and bring them to account for their deeds. And we are at least we are on a positive trajectory as a country. And the events in Parliament today said exactly that. So I think that we have a right to be feeling good, at least for the next 6 months or so as a country.
And on that note, I would like to thank my panel. I know he's got another SABC joke, but I'd like to thank my panel. Mondi Makanya is the editor of City Press, Adrian Basson is the editor of News 24, Kate Skinner is the executive director of the South African National Editors Forum, and he has a brand new website, Stefan Sprummer from Amabungani. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.